right, let's see. This is a rather ropey sensor in a rather ropey location. We thought that reflected real life quite well. It's actually in one of our engineers' flat near London, and his DSL has been bumping up and down quite a lot today. But anyway, hasn't actually connected since yesterday into Defender for IoT, just in case you were wondering, or hasn't seen any packets rather since yesterday. And we did indeed, in fact, I'll show it now, use, where is it? System settings, I think it is, the PCAP player to actually populate this particular one. So if you've got your little library of PCAP files, the ones that Richard promised to get for you, or if you do OT PCAP search on the internet, you will find a couple of public sources to download and start playing with. They're often a bit weird because they're very unique, of course, to the environments that have created them. So you're almost always better trying to get a hold of one out of a customer, or if you run some sort of IoT lab, which we know some of the larger partners do, then ask them for a couple of samples because they might be more appropriate to where you're working as well. So that's how you do it. You simply click upload. It can take some time. It depends how big these PCAPs are. Be aware it can take a little while to do the import. To replay all those network packets, it can take anywhere up to about a day, actually, if you've got some really large ones that need to be imported in. So just as a minor warning, it doesn't happen in a minute unless the PCAP files are quite small. It can take a little longer. We'll forget the front screen because it's not hugely interesting for the moment. If we were playing in one of our PCAP files, then the packet counter will be bouncing up and down here as they're being processed. Most interesting thing, and Richard mentioned this earlier as well, is our Purdue model. So this is a list of all the devices that we've discovered, and hence this is where we start concentrating on inventory. Let me just make this a bit bigger, and then we can start looking. So these are the Purdue models, lower level going all the way up to, well, actually you can zoom in, you can see some of the naming used in here as well. So there's process control and supervisory if you have Eagle Vision. Generally, the red ring ones are a little bit more interesting because they're PLCs normally. If you're scrolling far enough, of course, you get to see a bit more detail. So we click on the eye over here and select, let's say, this one. Now we can get an idea. This is some sort of Rockwell PLC that we're actually looking at. And in fact, we can get a bit more detail than that even as well. So now we can start having a look inside it. We can see it's got some sort of backplane running on here as well. So let's have a quick look and see what's on the backplane. Okay, nothing hugely interesting, some sort of comms adapter in this case. But you get the MAC address and their IP address if it has one, of course, as well, and a little bit of other interesting information. An incoming one possibly is if these things have a hardware key in them, quite a few of these PLCs have a key to enable it to go to edit mode or not, we'll start being able to check and see if the key is actually present or if it's actually turned on, as in you need a key to turn it on to program mode. So that's coming in a future update that we've seen a couple of times. Not in yet, just as a preview feature. And what else in here? Well, that's one view. So this is a nice graphical view, and you can see some of the interconnects, and you can zoom around to your heart's content, of course. You can, of course, search, and you can start listing it by protocol type, because, of course, nothing actually really talks TCP/IP in this world. They all have their own custom protocols, to which we have a nice answer to, of course, as well. We do have a protocol decode package as well, if you come across a brand new one. All the subnets it can actually see can sometimes be quite interesting. And, of course, if there is some TCP traffic, what type of information is being picked up as well. There's bound to be some Windows machines probably in here as well, for example. So we expect to see some SMB. In fact, there is a 445, for example, which, and even TeamViewer, as we mentioned earlier. As you go down, you can get different views of this. So you can get a nice, well, you can export it into Excel, of course, or some sort of CSV file. You get to see what's actually here. I imagine you might see some Windows in here somewhere. It's not all Siemens and Rockwell, is it? Oh, there's a very old server, obviously running in virtual. And then we do have a lot of reporting as well, which we'll come back to in a moment. This isn't really about the reporting angle. This is more about, well, let's have a look. It's more, of course, around. Now, we could show things like CVEs, that's devices that we detected with known public exploits. But because we've got things like an unpatched version of 2016, that's going to list pretty much any CVE ever published for Windows in that particular list. Internet connectivity, though, now that could be a key one. No device by default at least, unless it's some sort of exceptional or specific exception rule rather, should be speaking to the internet. So the fact that so many of these appear to have a direct connection to the internet, well, we've got big problems wherever this particular site might be. This is true. And then we can start to go through the timelines as well. For anyone who's born in the last 30 years, then a nice vertical Facebook timeline view is quite nice, of course. So you can actually go through with the time down the middle and see what actually has been happening. And if you go back far enough, sometimes you can see a threat update that we mentioned earlier. Yeah, of course, we're not going to see it now. Some PLC programming, controller updates. I hope this shows okay on the screen. Actually, sometimes it gets a bit blurred, doesn't it, when you go scrolling through at speed. Yeah, that's Sod's law. We're not going to find one. After we checked, you can actually see some of the threat packages being updated as well. So that is the Azure Defender portal inside the cloud, grabs hold of the recently released threat intelligence packages and downloads them directly onto the sensor. I suspect actually with this little cross we may find out why in a little bit. Data mining could be quite handy. What's a nice one we can look at from here? DNS entries. So let's find out, with all those internet connections, let's find out who they've been communicating with. Now, a lot of this, of course, bear in mind, this is a mock-up, by the way, as well. This is an engineer's little play pit he's got running in his own environment. We can see some expected locations. He's obviously got Chrome loaded or whatever he's been playing with. And, you know, we can see something a little bit unusual. Now, we've chosen something slightly benign as the little unusual example. If it was a truly unusual HTTP address, then it would have been picked up as a security alert. So if it was, I don't know, download virushere.com, if that even exists, but if it was a well-known one, of course, then it would be picked up as a real alert. So travel to a great place sounds anonymous enough, but maybe the actual site isn't, and what it's hosting maybe certainly isn't as well. And either way, why is a vibration sensor in your wind turbine trying to go to a travel to a great place? Maybe doesn't like the local environment and wants to move, but it's unlikely that they'll be going to anything publicly accessible. So again, you get some nice bits of data come out, which you can then start actioning. And again, you get all this from a couple of days worth of traffic that's come off the customer's network. So you're getting all this, and you can build up. There is risk reports you can go into here and actually build up. There's the CVE one. You get about a 30-page report automatically built for you. So if it is a true environment, as in a true production environment, then that'll make a bit more sense, of course, and produces a lovely PDF, all nicely tabled and table of contents and stuff that you can then use as part of your presentation back. And then I think let's get to a final one. Let's see if there's actually, maybe we won't. You can simulate an attack here as well. So if you want to simulate an attack from the internet against all your devices, this is quite clever. Because what it'll go out and do, it will see which one of your devices could theoretically be contacted by the internet. So it'll try, obviously, throwing packets at your various devices and see if they respond and whether it can see the routing information. Obviously, it has to be IP for this to get back out onto the internet. So what we're finding, at least for some customers that we've been talking to, is that ability actually for a nice threat event to be be picked up on is and a device successfully connecting to the internet. There's also things like reprogramming firmware and stop commands and all the standard stuff, but a nice one for us at least in this modern world is if a device is being successfully connected to either through a proxy or through a poorly configured firewall, then we need to know. So I did have a couple of ones I'd run earlier in here, but it looks like the demo gods have slightly switched that one off, but at least it gives us an idea at least of what's actually available. So this is all on the sensor. So this, of course, exists in the customer's environment. We will have other versions of sensors, of course, coming out over time. There's been some talk of having a nice container version. So rather than an ISO image, we'd have a container file instead. So anything that's capable of running a container file can then theoretically start to run a sensor as well. And this is just Richard and I rumor milling between us. But when that becomes available, of course, things like the Cisco switches are all based on some sort of Linux build as well. Even they have the ability in some cases, depending which switch you buy, to run containers, for example, as well. So rather than going and get hold of an HP or a Dell, your own bit of hardware to run a sensor on, in the not too distant future, hopefully we'll have the ability to run it on other types of devices as well, not just servers, for example. And of course, these things might end up being cloud hosted eventually as well. Now, in theory, you do that now through Hyper-V or something, but of course, I think that's probably a step too far for today, because that would involve all your devices having internet connectivity, of which we do find there are a lot of when we start going through customer reports, of course, for these particular areas. So that's local. That's what if you played with CyberX in the past, this is probably, apart from the lovely Microsoft logo at the top here, it's probably very similar to what you might be used to. So let's have a quick look at something else instead. And how are we doing? Oh, not too bad. It's this one, I think. So this is Defender for IoT. So this is the Azure portal, if you've not seen it. It was very boring. And what you're seeing now is a slight preview. If any of the partners are on the preview, then you've probably seen this already. Not quite sure when this is due out. I mean, I'll show you the preview bits in a moment. But if you want to get hold of the sensors, obviously there is one distributor of the sensor that comes pre-configured with the ISO already built in. That's Arrow in Israel. You can order these from. Or, of course, you can get hold of your own ISO file. Looks like 10.3.1 is the current stable version. Notice the engineer was playing with 10.4 earlier. And then you can start to onboard and get hold of the license files, etc. And then once you've connected all these in, I'm connected to quite a few different areas at the moment. And you can see actually that this is a dodgy engineer. Some of you may recognize the name actually. I think you can see that one of his is actually connected in the moment, and therefore can't quite read these columns very well. But he's had a recent threat intelligence update that's come down as well, which is why it's all green across here, because he's running the latest version of the sensor and also the threat intelligence updates as well. So they're automatically poked, as it were, into his sensor as and when they're actually released as well. And if you've got multiple factories, then this is when it starts to build up. You get different views, of course, depending, there wouldn't be names like this. This could be country names or assembly line names, whatever it might be. And as before, of course, you can build out a nice little graphical image with all the different ranges on as well. And the bits, now where are we? The bits that is interesting is this one. So let's build out for a few moments. So this is new. If you're not part of the preview, you won't have seen this yet, unless it's been demoed to you, of course. But this is, remember we looked in all those devices earlier, actually on the sensor. That same information is now available from the cloud. Now, imagine you had 100 different sensors, then it would all obviously coalesce into this one interface in the cloud. So now you have a unique view for your customer across all their sensors, no matter how far wide they are, as long as they're connected, of course, as one page, as it were, to look through them. So we can have a look, see if this actually works. And if we're lucky, this could be there we are. I remember the IP address. This is that box we were looking at earlier. So if we look at a few details, and we can even see the backplane information within Azure Defender for IoT in the cloud now as well. So I click on here. It's got it does say COM adapter, to be fair, and it's got the same model and version revision numbers as well. Now, if we click on one of these, to be fair, I'm not going to, because it produces an error which slows us down a little bit. But that would actually, you can see actually, once we get beyond preview, these will light up and you'll get a bit more information coming through as well. Now, this is quite important because it leads into after the break actually as well. We start talking about what happens when we start to bring Sentinel into the picture and how that starts to expand some of our knowledge as well. But before we get that far, if we, get rid of that. Finally, it's full screen, so I'm going to get a bit more on here. So by hiding the URL bar. Now, this device inventory. Now, we're going to have the session in, after the break, actually, which will look at Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. So remember when we said our sensors are almost always, a few minor exceptions if you configure them so, almost always completely passive. So MDE, I'm not sure if any of you are aware of Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. And not to steal the thunder from before, but it is able to go out and actually do some stuff about what's on the network as well. So when it finds information or objects, let's say, then it will start to pipe them into this. So now we've got to the story of Defender for IoT and Defender for Endpoints, and now starting to share information. Now that integration, of course, will grow further and further over time. This is obviously step one to get them actually talking, so you can actually see some cross-fertilization of intelligence and information, and in our case, of course, device inventory to figure out what's actually in this. And as we saw earlier, each of these devices had an alert level as well, or can do if things have been configured. So you then start to get a view of which device is at your highest risk, and that could be other things. As opposed to just the actuator or the valve or the heat sensor. It could literally be, or could even be an NT4 machine, which we see quite often still. XP is far more common. So it could be Windows related as well. If that's actually running, it's got a serial card in it running some really old style devices that are still valid on quite a few factory floors, for example. So this is quite new. Date-wise, we're not quite sure when this is coming out. Again, if you're on the private preview program, you have access now. So you've probably been playing with it a little bit already. If you're not, then I think most people are welcome to join if you're, as a partner organisation, would like to. It generally involves getting involved with the product groups a little bit more. Certainly does from the Sentinel perspective. Most of these groups now have their preview feature programs. It gives you early availability of what's coming. They'll also ask you to test out various scenarios to see if they work as expected. Or what would you rather see? So ability to influence the product comes a little bit as part of this environment or community that you can actually get involved with. Now, I think I may give you, as we've had some nice questions and Rich has answered them, let's give a few minutes back so we can all go and grab a cup of tea or coffee. That finishes off the inventory part. So if there's any questions on the inventory, then feel free to type them in now. I'll just check actually. Now I can actually.
Yeah, there's a few coming through. It's good to see your questions. Thank you for keeping interactive with us all. Great session so far, Paul.
I'm just reading through them now. We don't talk about competition. Because of course there isn't any. No. We're well aware of course, who they are. Now they work in a very different way, of course, to us. So they're coming from a very traditional sense. And what we are finding, of course, is they're being bought up at the same space as well. And so some of the traditional IT security companies now investing or looking at acquiring OT as well. So there are a range of different ways. Some of them are easier to demo with. That's some very hard feedback we've been giving into the product group, Richard and I. And hence, hopefully, in the next couple of months, we'll see the result of that. We're seeing part of it already, of course, from a cost perspective. But are there many new features coming? Yes. We thought there were when we set out the agenda for this, to give you an idea. There will be additional sensor capability, maybe not quite so passive in the future if you don't wish it to be. This isn't any of this by default, of course. And therefore, the ability to actually go out and build up this inventory. And remember, we think the inventory is perhaps the most key aspect. So unless you know what's out there, and therefore what could be at risk, then the story becomes a very short one indeed. If you can go into a customer and say, here's these 1,000, pumps, you didn't even know you had. And if you fiddle with this one and fiddle with that one, then it affects the whole production output, or you end up polluting an entire factory line, wherever it might be, and then it becomes quite important. And those are the key areas that we want to dig out. And we're aware, to find everything, we're going to need some help. It's not all passive network monitoring, and that's where some of the competition is slightly ahead, we think. However, it's very hard to talk with competition, of course, because we concentrate on our own environments first. From our perspective, no one else has Sentinel. No one else has Defender for Endpoint. No one else has Microsoft 365 Defender, period, in fact. No one else has an entire IoT platform that can all be brought to bear in this area. We do expect Defender for IoT to broaden out into the entire IoT space as it grows and matures, of course, from the acquisition we made last year. So there are lots of new things coming. Container one is perhaps one of the bigger ones, but from my perspective at least. We did hear rumors of a point-and-click decode package as well. So we do have something called the Horizon SDK. So you can go in there now and actually start writing your own decodes, which we have found to be quite useful for certain government agencies as well. They like to be very private and they don't want us publicizing, the fact they use these particular proprietary protocols. However, the partner managing them can go on site and decode them for them and make it part of the monitoring aspect for Defender for IoT. So that, rather than being an SDK, was being talked about being more of a click-through website or dashboard rather. So you can start moving little headers around, as it were, to highlight, which information is which to then feed into the packet monitoring aspects. So there's some quite interesting stuff happening, actually. From Richard and I's perspective. But
there is. Paul, there's two other ones in there I think we can address in a couple of minutes we've got before we take a break. One is about the map. So the idea of having thousands of devices in inventory and then mapping that out automatically across the per view model. And the question was, how do we make that simpler when you start getting thousands of devices?
That's a great question,
isn't it?
Just trying to find it. I think this is the one, isn't it? The device map.
Yeah. So when you're looking at this model, you're only going to see the number of devices that sensor saw. So if it's connected to one network segment, it might only be a few hundred devices, in which case is what you see here. It's manageable. But if you had one sensor connected to 1,000 or 2,000 devices, then yes, this is going to get unmanageable. You can move things around in this diagram manually and make the diagram look like you want it to do, and then export it or save it, but you can't today do much more with it than that. I think, and Paul, I was open to your opinions as well, is that this will move to Azure. And when this data is in Azure, all of the same connectors and the ability to map it can then go into things like anything you want to do, but we've got Power BI, we've got maps, you can overlay it with other information. And I think that's when we really unlock the power of the partner to be more creative with this information. And as I said before, this does lead to the idea of having something like Azure Digital Twins. So if you had a 3D map of the customer's environment, you could actually move these little dots and put them to where they physically are in the world.
And to build on that, of course, it does have a filter in here. So if you need to start filtering down because you've got too many devices, even on this one sensor, then there are actually working for some reason at the moment. Oh, I see, police sector group over here. So you can then filter down by, let's say, whatever DMP3 it might happen to be. So you can get your own view on the data if you're looking for something specific. I'd imagine the real question though is when you use the cloud version, so you've got 1,000 sensors feeding 1,000 devices feeding the sensor, and you've got 1,000 sensors. So you've got, what's that, 1 million devices? Was it always 100,000? I can't remember. Anyway, lots of information. Remember, this is all stored in a database in our cloud. It's actually stored in something called Log Analytics under the covers, and you can query Log Analytics all day long. You can build models from it, as in you can build little graphical models you can display on dashboards, and we'll show the beginnings of one of these actually after the break when we look at Sentinel, because Sentinel is based on Log Analytics as well, so it gives you an example of what can be done with the underlying data. So hopefully this is the option for now. You can filter based on subnet, on protocol type, on if it is TCP/IP, on obviously which port number that happens to be using. But hopefully you'll get a more interesting answer after the break.